there, art nerds. So today we are taking a look at another Money-Mairtini product. This pretty little compact contains an even prettier little compact if I can get it open. But I want to know if all that glitters is gold and if these Money-Mairtini watercolors really do shimmer and shine. Nope, they're not metallic, they're just regular watercolors, but I couldn't resist some really dorky puns. So, are these super cute, confection looking Money-Mairtini watercolors worth your time and effort? You guys will have to watch to find out. And somebody needs to get their brakes checked. Hey there, art nerds. So I am here today to finish what I started. We're going to take a look at the other Money-Mairtini watercolor palette that I ordered from AliExpress. If you're new here, you might wonder what I mean by other. Not too long ago, I reviewed the Money-Mairtini Brillian Rays solid watercolor palette in their adventure colorway. So they have several different sets and several different options. This is the one that I reviewed last time, and sad to say, I was a little bit less than impressed. Now, Money-Mairtini makes several watercolor products, including some super granulating watercolors that I'm going to review for you guys at a later date. I'm like halfway through that review, but they also make watercolor paper, and I have reviewed that here on the channel as well. So if you're curious about this brand, make sure you check the description. This was purchased out of pocket from AliExpress using funds from my Patreon. So if you like what I do and you want to help me continue to explore wild, weird, and wonderful watercolor from around the world, you can join me at patreon.com/nattosoup and get early access to reviews like this one. Inside this gold tone box is a Money-Mairtini swatch card, the palette itself, which looks a lot like makeup, and then on the back of the box, it promises to blind you. I'm going to try to have it so you guys can see it. There we go. Highest degree of light fastness, very pure and intense colors, perfectly thinnable with water, maximum degree of transparency, finest pigments in a pure quality of gum arabic and honey. And their website is artfire.com.cn, and these were made in China. I'll admit, when I ordered this from AliExpress, I expected this to be a lot bigger. I was expecting like a Magello airtight size palette, much bigger than this. But here is our very plastic little compact. I mean, it is very, very plastic. It is pretty though, I'll give it that. And then inside, there are the paints, and they look very bright and vibrant, and then a little wash off sponge. And I think this is meant to be a travel set. Oh, and there's already a hair inside. Hooray! At least that lets you know that a human was involved in this process. So here's my order history from AliExpress, and we're gonna scroll down, and I thought it was in this order here. It's right around this time. Here we go. It's been a while. So I paid $39.90 for this 25 color set. You can kind of see why I was expecting a larger palette than what I actually received. It's currently going for $35.70. The brush included here must be pretty dang small because the palette you guys see is even smaller. It also promises honey. I have my doubts because the last Money-Mairtini palette I reviewed was definitely student grade. Now they do offer drop shipping and wholesale. So for those of you guys who don't know, drop shipping is when another business basically has the storefront and it's fulfilled through someone on AliExpress. If I could read Chinese, that might have been helpful in knowing how big this would be. But you guys can see the listing itself just really didn't have a lot of information. So Can't really blame me for thinking it was going to be a little bit different than it actually is. The listing also doesn't seem to make any promises at all about quality, about what went into the manufacturing process. Like, there's basically nothing here to work with. So I'm going, at least in their defense, usually I'll tell you guys any promise that they make is a promise that can be held against them. They didn't make any promises, so there's not really much that I can hold against them. There's also no paperwork inside the package itself, so we're going to be going with previous experience with Mairtini, as well as experience with other Chinese watercolor companies like Paul Rubens and Supervision. Today, we're going to be swatching these watercolors on their included swatch sheet. We are also going to swatch them on my preferred paper of choice for these unbox and swatch reviews, Blick's cotton rag watercolor paper. We are probably going to do some color mixing. We're probably going to do a wet into wet test, and we're probably going to talk about comparable watercolor offerings once we've gotten kind of a feel for these and I can start pulling some out of my stash. Since these seem like they're cake style watercolors, I am not going to pre-activate them because I have found that cake style or Gensai style watercolors typically perform poorly when you pre-activate them, and I want to give these the best and fairest shot possible. And if you guys are curious about the colors in this set, we have titanium white, lemon yellow, Mairtini yellow, yellow deep, cadmium yellow orange, scarlet lacquer, alizarin crimson lake, cobalt blue, ultramarine deep, blue idanthine, Prussian bluey, dioxazine purple, purple carmine, phthalo turquoise, phthalo green light, hooker's green, phthalo green deep, sap green, olive green, yellow ochre, ivory black, burnt umber, Venetian red, and burnt sienna. And as you guys can see, some of these colors are pretty intense. And just based on my experiences using Mairtini watercolors in the past, it would not surprise me if these had a lot of optical brighteners to make them look very, very appealing in those cakes. While these do activate relatively quickly, they don't really have much color impact. I was expecting much more saturation and a lot more strength for this type of formulation because cake style watercolors tend to deliver a lot of color. I felt like I would see more impact at least on this paper. I also noticed at this point that the case doesn't have any mixing areas and is very lightweight and kind of flimsy. As I'm grabbing the paint, I'm pushing the palette around, as you guys just saw, which does not make it great for a travel situation because you don't want to have to hold your palette down while you're painting on, say, a picnic bench, for example. So while these do activate relatively quickly, they really don't have a lot of impact. They don't have much oomph to them, which is what I noticed about the other Mairtini watercolors as well. And I thought surely with as bright and brilliant as these are, we would have more color impact, at least on this paper. We still have to try it out on the Blick. The case also doesn't have any mixing areas, and the whole thing is very lightweight and kind of easy, very easy to push around. All right, let's put these to a real swatch test. Let's swatch them out on the Blick Premier Cold Press 100% Cotton Watercolor Block. And this is kind of our control because I have done all of the student grade showdown and will continue to do pretty much all of my watercolor swatching on this type of paper. Here's a little chance at redemption swatching on cotton rag paper. Unfortunately, I noticed that the colors, once we swatch them, are desaturated and kind of weak. They look really great in the cakes, but they don't perform very well on the paper, which is kind of disappointing. There are definitely better cake style palettes out there. We're going to talk about some of those cake style palettes specifically, but I also want to let you guys know that if you like this style of palette, Gensai watercolors might also be an area that you want to look at. And I'll try to remember to link some of my playlists down in the description below for you guys if you guys are interested in checking out Gensai style watercolors. The neutrals also felt kind of off, especially burnt umber and burnt sienna. I wasn't really surprised though that these were so unimpressive. The Brillian Rays palette is pretty similar in performance. I had hoped that this palette would be a little bit of redemption for Money-Mairtini and better than the Brillian Rays, but no, they're both pretty when it comes to actual saturation and activation. Even on the Blick paper, the colors are really desaturated and weak. The neutrals also feel kind of off, especially the burnt umber, which is right here, and the burnt sienna. There are definitely better cake style palettes out there, and we'll talk about those in a bit. So next, I want to do a little bit of color mixing. Unfortunately, they don't really give us a space to mix. Even just painting this white or putting a white liner in would help with that, especially because you do have the little divots here. Now we do have a lot of colors in this palette, but there aren't necessarily any colors that would be immediately useful as skin or hair tone, so some color mixing would be necessary. Since no mixing surface was provided, I used the lid as the mixing surface, and it did not work very well. The color mixes are really weak and unimpressive. You do get a lot of different colors, a lot of secondary and tertiary and complementary colors, but whether full strength or mixed strength, it's pretty unimpressive. And I paint a lot of people, animals, and flowers, as well as environments, all things that require a lot of careful color mixing to get skin tones right, for example. This palette would not be a good fit if you're into portraiture, if you're into painting comics, anything like this. This palette is not a good fit for that. I realize this lid is absolutely not meant for color mixing. The paint wants to bead up on it. I can't even use the wells. It's really difficult to get a good mix of the colors, but I am using what was provided. And this is a small travel size palette. I really don't understand why they didn't choose to utilize the lid. That really seems like a waste. Now, if you have this palette, you could maybe spray paint it with some gloss enamel and kind of make it a little bit better for this, but then you'd have to mask this off. Frankly, it's just not worth it. There are better travel palettes out there that will facilitate that need a little bit better. But even that in mind, these color mixes are really weak and unimpressive, just really in keeping with the original Money-Mairtini palette review. These might be a slightly different formulation, but they handle almost the same and have the same problems that the prior palette had. Next up is the wet into wet test. Rather than wasting a whole sheet of paper on a block, I'm going to use the space that we have right here. So rather than using a whole sheet of paper, I used the remaining space on the block. The colors are really desaturated and unimpressive in this wet into wet. Who's surprised? They really tend to fall apart when you add a lot of water. That just seems to be the vibe of these watercolors. So it's really hard to recommend them when they fail on basically everything I've tested them on. So far, these Money-Mairtini watercolors are not too impressive. They're actually pretty disappointing. I still need to do the lift test, and then we'll talk about some comparable cake style watercolors. Everything lifts just about the same in the lift test, which is not what we want to see because different pigments are going to have different granulating and different staining properties. So the fact that everything lifts the same is either a statement about the pigment particle size that they're grinding to, or to the binder that they're using, or to the materials being used in making the paints. Either way, it's not something I want to see. All right, let's talk about some alternatives to this very cute, very aesthetic, and very disappointing little watercolor set. I'm also going to work in clips from the full reviews, and I highly recommend that if any of these look interesting to you, check the description because I'll have them linked out for you. So we are going to talk about the most obvious, or one of the most obvious, and unfortunately I can't find that palette and I have no idea where it's walked off to. It would be the Phoenix Chinese style watercolor palette. Now that is meant to emulate Chinese style watercolors, but it's pretty similar to this palette in that it isn't quite as saturated as I would like. That said, it is far more aesthetic than this palette, but the packaging is very nice cardboard, so it may not be up to the wear and tear that you might want to put a mini palette like this one through. I'll include a clip for the Phoenix color palette right here. Although the Phoenix Chinese style watercolors are some of the most aesthetic, beautiful watercolors I've had the pleasure of testing on the channel, they are not really very good at being watercolors. There are definitely better options out there at about the same price point or cheaper, and while they are very pretty, their half pan Phoenix counterparts do perform better and you get more colors for your money, and there are also just better and cheaper brands out there. They are in a cardboard package, but compared to the Money-Mairtini, these are awesome because they are much more saturated than the Money-Mairtini watercolors that we looked at, even though the neutrals are still kind of weird and they kind of flood the area. They are also much prettier. So if you're really just looking for a pretty watercolor palette to stage with your art, the Phoenix Chinese style watercolors are far prettier. Here is the head-to-head comparison between the Chinese style and the original style, as well as talking about some price. I have the whole review here on the channel, so if these look intriguing to you, you should definitely check the review out. I even put them through a Gensai style field test to see if they'd fit the bill. So another palette that I think this is very comparable to would be the Owen palette. These are made by the same company that makes Paul Rubens, and as you guys can see, very similar cake style palette. It is a larger format, has room for brushes, has room for mixing. It still comes in a plastic case, and it did come with this sticker on top of it. It does have a ring loop on the back. If you like ring loops, I don't like trusting them too much. They tend to fail. So I will include a clip from this review right here. These are made by Paul Rubens' parent company and are kind of about on par with their Mei Liang Pigments line. So is it any surprise that I like these better? You guys can already see that these are a lot more saturated and vibrant than the Money-Mairtini watercolors. They pack a whole lot more color punch, and they just look so much better than the Money-Mairtini when you swatch them. They're not necessarily as pretty in the palette, but they're not ugly either, and they handled pretty well in the wet into wet test. So I would say these are comparable with the Mei Liang pigments. Speaking of the Mei Liang pigments, here is a little snippet of these. These are the student grade line from Paul Rubens. The colors are really bright and vibrant and saturated, and even when doing the field test, I kind of forgot that I was working with a student grade product. Here we have regular Paul Rubens. This is their professional line, although I think they've also released like a line even nicer than these that I haven't had a chance to check out yet. I actually like the Mei Liang pigments a little bit better than the Paul Rubens because I feel like they handle so similarly, and the Mei Liang pigments is at about the same price point. The Owen watercolors are also made by this company. They are in these really cute square half pans, and much like the Mei Liang and the Aowen, the Owen are very saturated and deliver a lot of color and a lot of granulation and impact. These are great student grade watercolors. On a similar note, now we've got the Paul Rubens Professional. This is one of their travel palettes. Their travel palettes are so stinking cute. This is very small, very aesthetic, and what I love about it is the colors are very saturated. It is also a plastic case, although this one has little pebbles glued on top. They also have a starry sky design that is super cute. The paints inside, though you get less of the paints, they are higher quality paints that are much more saturated. And I think if you want watercolors that are both beautiful to work with, or I'm sorry, beautiful to look at and beautiful to work with, this palette could be a good choice. And the bonus is this palette here costs about what the Money-Mairtini palette costs. In fact, all of these palettes are pretty comparable in price to the Money-Mairtini palette. This little Money-Mairtini palette is not a particularly inexpensive little palette. And I will include the clip for this palette right here. This is Paul Rubens Professional Grade Pocket Set. It is beautiful. The reason I'm including this is because they handle like cake style watercolors where they are already semi-moist. They are in very shallow pans. They are as large a pan as they can fit in a mini palette this size. So very tiny pans, but as big as they could get, and you get a wide variety of colors. This is also at about the same price point as the Money-Mairtini, and if you heard me talk about Mei Liang and Paul Rubens before, you guys know I prefer these far above and beyond the Money-Mairtini set. It also hits the notes for being very pretty and very aesthetic, so it is both a good performing little set and it is very pretty. And then finally, I feel like it wouldn't be a Natto Soup Studio review if I didn't pull out one of these superior palettes. This is their folding fan style palette, and it has kind of a novel form factor that once fully dried does pack up fairly compact, but it is about the size of a placemat, and it has these fairly large pans, although not deep at all. These are very thin little chiclets of paint in here. Now, you can reposition the paints to be in whatever order you would prefer. There are some pastels and more opaque colors. There are some granulating colors. The only downside, really, in my opinion, is that Superior doesn't seem to sell refills for this, but that may change if we keep nagging them. So I think this palette is a lot of fun. The colors are more saturated than in this palette, and I will include a link to this review here. Wouldn't be a Natto Soup Studio review without mentioning these weird Superior watercolors. In the initial review, I compare them to Gansai style watercolors because that's the niche that I think they kind of hit. So if you are looking for a whole bunch of pre-mixed colors, some pastels, some very bright, if you are looking for the larger pan size so that you can fit your larger brushes in, and if you're looking for quick activation, I think you should check this palette over the Money-Mairtini palette. It definitely seems kind of gimmicky, but I was really impressed with this palette, impressed with the colors that it has to offer, impressed with the fact that we can move the colors around very easily, which is not always common in this style of Superior set, impressed with the color activation and the color saturation. And when I was painting the field test with this palette, I forgot I was doing a field test. I just kind of fell into painting and enjoying myself. So I think you'll enjoy this palette far more than you'll enjoy the Money-Mairtini palette. It was a little bit easier to find, but it's still pretty easy to find now. And I hope you guys will check out the full review if you think this palette is interesting. I also have a field test that you can watch if you want to see how these handle when painting people and flowers. Fortunately, for the pros and cons, I don't really have a lot of pros to list with this set. There's a lot of cons, so I guess we're going to do just cons. First of all, it can be kind of hard to find this set. I've only ever seen Money-Mairtini products on AliExpress. Sometimes they're on there, sometimes they're not. It's also kind of expensive for the amount of paint you get and the size of paint and the quality of paint you get, especially compared to some of the other student grade watercolors that we've talked about on the channel. The colors themselves are really weak. They're just unimpressive. There's not a lot of granulation. They lift very easily. They mix muddy colors. The wet to wet test is okay, but the colors are a lot less saturated than I want. Basically, you're going to end up using up a lot of paint to get anything out of this palette. So it's very, very difficult for me to recommend. It is also much smaller than I thought it would be. The listing includes basically no real information. And while it's pretty, there are other very pretty watercolor palettes on the market that perform better than this palette and maybe more available than this palette is. Really, there isn't anything to recommend this palette. Y'all can probably guess my verdict. There's nothing to recommend this palette. There's no reason why you should go out of your way to get this palette. If you already have this palette, it is not the worst watercolor palette I've reviewed. Not by a long shot. It's just kind of small and kind of weak, and it doesn't really have any mixing spaces, but it's not the worst palette. We have reviewed worse, but I'm also just really disappointed with Money-Mairtini's showing. I had higher hopes for them, and they're just very unimpressive. It's hard to find information about the brand at all. I have tried on several occasions when reviewing the Brillian Rays palette, when reviewing the granulating colors, which I still need to share with you guys, when reviewing their paper. There's just no information about them that I can find in English to share with you guys. So if you guys know the skinny on this brand, are they white labeling from somebody else? Is this a student grade watercolor and I'm just completely, not student grade, children's grade watercolor, and I am just completely holding them to a standard that they can't meet? Let me know down in the comments below, but hopefully I can help you guys skip this one if possible so that you can buy a palette that you'll like and enjoy and actually be able to use. Because with this palette, with the way these colors are, not only are you going to be using up your watercolor faster, trying to paint very little, honestly, but it's not going to have the brilliance and the saturation that other brands may be able to give you. And as somebody who loves watercolor, loves to paint with watercolor, has a watercolor comic, and likes to review watercolors, I just can't recommend this set to you, and I hope you guys will skip it. So disappointingly, these Money-Mairtini watercolors are not quite golden. They're more gilded than anything. They are bright and colorful though. They sure do look appealing, but unfortunately, in my opinion, the cons outweigh the pros. You can find them on AliExpress, but they're kind of challenging to find. They are very compact, but they don't contain a lot of paint. And there are better paints out there and smaller palettes out there at around the same price point that I think will make you happier. And that's what I'm about here on the channel. I want to help you find the right art supplies that will help you make art a habit. And one of the ways we can do that is by finding good and affordable art supplies. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. I hope you guys found this useful, helpful, and informative. We are, fingers crossed, supposedly wrapping up the student grade showdown. So if you are shopping for a student grade palette that will fit your needs, I have reviewed dozens of them at this point in depth. So I will link that playlist down in the description below, as well as some other playlists I think you guys will find helpful. If you're new here, hi, hello, welcome. I'm Becca Hilburn. I'm a watercolor comic artist and illustrator. I make the watercolor webcomic 7-inch Cara. I sure hope you guys will check it out at 7inchcara.com. If you are looking to acquire some art to give or to deck your own halls, I hope you guys will check out my art prints over in the Natto shop at nattosoup.com/shop. And if you like what I do and you want to help me continue to do it, you can join me on Patreon and get early access. Oh no, why did that have to start? Get early access to reviews like this one, access to tutorials and printable coloring sheets and blog posts and more at patreon.com/nattosoup. And I hope if you liked what I do here, you'll leave me a thumbs up. If you've got any questions, let me know down in the comments below, and consider subscribing and clicking the bell notification to let YouTube know that you want to hear more from me. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. It is a little disappointing that this pricey little palette really is not going to be that serviceable. I do not like wasting money, but at least I can stop you from wasting yours, and that is a good thing. So have a wonderful day, guys. Bye.